Welcome to the Brainstorm, episode 80. In person this week, another ARK on-site. Let's talk. A lot of stuff has been happening with Satya, Microsoft, both on the AI and the quantum front. So maybe we'll dive into Majorana. And then obviously Grok 3. A lot of noise there as well. But Brett, we've discussed quantum for a long time. It's actually one of the questions we get most frequently from people. We're out there talking about disruptive innovation, and everyone says, isn't quantum the next big thing? Is quantum the next big thing?
It's certainly not the next big thing. And I think that's part of the problem is I remember even a decade ago, James Wang in one of our brainstorms was like, we should be focusing purely on quantum. This obviates the need for everything else. You don't even need chip cost declines anymore once quantum computing is available. But the once quantum computing is available is the whole wrinkle and actually valley of despair between here and that promised land. And so at a very high level, the quantum computing landscape is populated by announcements of big breakthroughs, which sometimes are good technical achievements, but don't meaningfully pull forward the time frame in which we think they're going to be commercially useful. And so Microsoft announced basically a new way to create qubits, which are the fundamental units you use to run a quantum computer. These are, I'd call it a topological qubit. They basically have this complex way you can manufacture a surface that naturally is able to hold more stable qubits. And the reason more stable qubits is important is because you produce these qubits, these physical qubits, but to do useful operations, you have to be able to extract data off of them and then to do multiple cycles of calculation without getting stuff wrong. And so with Microsoft's architecture, you could potentially have 100 physical qubits to every one logical qubit, which is actually a useful qubit for doing calculations. And so the challenge for Microsoft and for all of the kinds of quantum computing is, can you scale up the number of qubits and also scale up the number of logical qubits that you use for computation? And a key kind of threshold would be if you can get to 4,000 logical qubits, then you can begin to break encryption or 2048 RSA encryption. So that's one of these things people are saying, well, that's obviously useful because, it could break a lot of stuff. So at 100 to 1, that would mean you would need 400,000 of these new Microsoft qubits to get there. Microsoft right now on their chip has maybe produced 8 physical qubits.
I feel the maybe there is key.
Yeah.
Because they won't know.
Yes. That's still under dispute. So it's they've produced an idea of how they are going to produce 8. And so if you compare to other quantum computing architectures, you have to, 20 years ago is when with trapped ion quantum computers, you had 8 physical qubits. Microsoft, maybe is there now. It's interesting for quantum computing because this is a different branch in the technological tree. Maybe they can accelerate this faster than those other guys have accelerated because it's just different. But these are, scaling manufacturing of this stuff, or even just manufacturing it and proving it works, is really challenging. The chip then itself has to be held at something 0.1 above absolute zero or something, has to be held extraordinarily cold to operate. But because people are so interested in quantum computing, somebody makes an announcement and then there's lots of press around it. And then quotes that come off of it are misreported. Satya says, within years, we could potentially have commercial quantum utility. I don't think that's at all realistic.
Do you think that it is somewhere down the line? At some point, quantum happens or no? And I'll say let's say within the next 30 to 50 years.
Okay. But you can always, I think with the technology forecasting, it's a common phenomenon where people say this is 25 years away and that always recedes. You never reel it in. And, with quantum computing, an interesting thing that's happening is advances in AI are potentially providing some of the utility that you would use quantum computing for. So people are presenting quantum computing should be very good at simulating kind of molecules, right? Because those are like quantum entities. And so like you map like a qubit to a specific atom, and then you stitch it together and you have like a perfect model of an atom. So you can do all this great simulation. But AI is proving very good at like doing kind of good enough modeling of molecules at scale to produce things like AlphaFold that gives you protein structures and that kind of stuff. And so then is there going to be as much urgency to try to like build this quantum computing system that can do this when you have AI already delivering results and getting better and better over time? Mm-hmm. I don't know. So like whether it'll happen more quickly if people throw more capital at it and less quickly if people throw less. It's hard to figure out what the incremental steps are going to be that allows this technology to attract the capital to follow like a reasonable cost decline over time. And it might be just like a huge technical engineering steep like climb that requires a ton of resources thrown at it. And so then it may always kind of recede.
Mm-hmm. So do you believe Microsoft that this is a major breakthrough? In the announcement I heard, they think we're only a few years away from commercial applications now. It sounds like you don't believe that.
I'm not even sure if you look at the full context of Satya's quote, that's what he intended to say.
Okay. Yeah,
I think the few years away is a few years away, we will demonstrate that this 8 qubit chip is something that works.
Okay.
That then conceptually we think we can stack them all together to create, much bigger chips. The problem with dealing with these quantum systems is like they are so fragile. The process of going from like, hey, here's a little bit of this that works to now I'm going to create like a huge, plane of it that works, tends to create problems that you didn't anticipate. And so I believe that what he was saying was like, yes, we're going to demonstrate we can make this chip, and we've designed it so that it can scale. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can realistically say they know they've designed it that they can't scale. And even so, the way in which the chip is constructed is you take, I think it's indium arsenide, and like you deposit aluminum on top of it, and you create these like nanowire structures that, it's like this is a whole nother manufacturing process of the type that you need for doing like silicon chips. So you have to scale up like a whole new set of tooling and processes. You have to like super cool the chip for it to operate. Like there's, it's definitely not years away on this technological branch for commercial utility. Now, I do think it's major in that previously we had like a couple flavors of qubits that are proceeding along and burning capital to try to get technological advance and moving slowly. Now you have a third flavor where you can throw capital at that. And maybe
it might work.
Maybe it turns out to have like a better learning curve, right. And so you can like invest in it and maybe accelerate and catch up and then go past. But
isn't that somewhat similar to AI, right? You had like so many different flavors, and then there was one, and people were like, "Oh, this one scales."
Yes, and I mean even within like AI space. Like, so the way you're framing it would be like the transformer breakthrough was like, hey, this is good at translating one language to another. And it turns out that underlying kind of architecture is good at generating language generally. And you can do all kinds of things on the back end of that. And so then there's all kinds of obvious utility there. And so then you throw huge resources at it. I think the challenge with quantum computing is even if it turns out that these chips work, you still have to like figure out a way for people to at least believe there's a somewhat reasonable ROI on throwing billions of dollars of resource at it. If it's still living in kind of like the research lab space, then it's always kind of a cost center. And it's always I think a issue I have with the industry generally is the industry seems to subsist by promoting commercial applications that aren't actually real and meaningful, but are more like PR moves by the person who's the prospective customer and clear PR moves by the quantum computing maker, where they're like, yes, we're doing this thing. But if you kind of like dig under the covers and you're like, well, how is this actually useful for the end customer? The answers seem to get very muddy,
right?
And so then It's kind of like, or like are so narrow and niche. It's like, well, that's an example, but it's not actually an example that's meaningful to getting an ROI. With kind of language models or even like image generation, which hasn't scaled revenue nearly as much, like you can clearly see how this is going to be useful for some set of applications and people are going to use this to do stuff. Do you know what I mean? So
Before we get to Grok, one clarifying point. When I was reading about this news, people were describing it as they created a new state of matter. Is that true?
Well, okay, so
Good question.
so, wait, I'm gonna like mangle the vocabulary here, but yes, there is a certain there's like a conjectured particle that is both its own, I think, particle and antiparticle at the same time that you can create within this surface that they have constructed, as in like the surface attracts that particle. But my interpretation of it, I'm not sure this is true, is it's just like within the context of that surface, it's best to interpret how it behaves, how the matter behaves, as being its own particle and antiparticle at the same time. But does that mean you've actually created that particle? Or is it just like that's the most convenient way to do the math on what happens within the context of that surface?
Sounds like something I'll need to grok later.
So
Good segue. Good segue.
It's like a virtual. My read was kind of. It's like you have virtually created these kind of like pockets of matter that behave in that way.
Right.
But maybe I'm certainly not an advanced physicist, so probably the wrong person to ask.
Okay.
All right, Grok 3. It's in the wild. We've compared it, episode 79, head to head with some of the others, but we were not paying for the Pro version or the Extra Pro. I don't know, ChatGPT, OpenAI's.
There's free, plus, and Pro.
Okay, I think most of us use Plus.
Yeah.
You're a Pro. What's your analysis on the comparison between Pro and Grok 3 progress?
Well, actually, I have a question for you all. Within your kind of like daily driver AI model, like what do you go to right now, as of now, when you need to answer a question?
Right now, I have one web browser and I have OpenAI and Perplexity up. And Grok, I'll ask, like with Grok 3, I'll ask it far more frequently. Grok 2 almost never asked it anything. I think Perplexity for me is now falling out of the rotation, and I'm going more Grok and ChatGPT.
I'm mostly Perplexity for search, ChatGPT for tasks, which mostly consists of please write this better.
Yeah, but you haven't switched over to Grok yet, though.
I've used it a bit. I think I just naturally still default to those two.
Right, but based on like, are you going to like make the active choice to switch yet? Do you think?
I have yet to download the
You don't have the
standalone
app?
Yeah. So once I do that, maybe I will start defaulting there.
This might be the first app I have before you.
Yeah. Well, I get a feel for what it can do
Yeah.
using it off of X, but I feel like I can still get that from Perplexity. And for the task-based prompts, I feel ChatGPT does an excellent job.
Yeah, because from a benchmark perspective, Grok 3 was, my read of like, it is at the pre-trained model level, it's extraordinarily capable. It's like right at the frontier with 4.0 and Anthropic's models. And then at the reasoning engine they've stuck on top of it is lagging a little behind, but months behind, not years behind, and is on par with what O1 can do, and maybe close to O3 Mini. These names are stupid, by the way.
They're horrible.
Anyway, but like a little below probably state of the art that OpenAI at least has behind the scenes and maybe stuff they've released. But like their pace of advance is notable, and kind of like having a really good performant pre-trained model, I think, is a precondition to actually developing a good reasoning model. And because of Elon's maniacal urgency and kind of velocity of, I'm going to double the number of GPUs in this one building in Tennessee and use that to pre-train an even bigger model. I think there's a reasonable case to be made that actually they'll begin to surpass on benchmarks performance. And these AI systems, at least on the consumer and prosumer facing side, are not just the underlying models. There's also a series of choices about how the information is presented to users. And so it's like, for me, I use OpenAI, I use ChatGPT voice mode to as I'm walking or driving, to continue to do work and learn stuff. And I find it really, really useful, even though it's operating on a lower model than I would use for that stuff if I'm kind of doing it via typing. But, to prepare for a podcast or something, to learn someone's bio, ask about the bio, try to figure out what questions I'm going to ask, I find it a very good partner. And only just over the weekend did Grok release its voice mode, which includes some pretty lewd voices as well. So that's another differentiation here, is you can imagine once they push to API, it's clear that XAI is just going to be less, call it, paternal about what you're allowed to do with these things. And so if you're trying to make an X-rated AI bot, Grok might be your only API you can go to.
That's true.
And that's actually, if you look at the history of technology, the real pusher of adoption here is the porn side.
Right.
And so if you're really wanting to infiltrate the world with your model, making that available could be actually vastly superior strategy.
The question I have is, given what just happened with Grok, they haven't come up with anything new on the technical training side. It was just they were able to deploy scale faster than anyone. Is that defensible now that people understand this can't be done? What Elon just did was tell every other major player that you can push the pace significantly faster if you have to. And now the question is, I would assume Sam Altman is sitting there saying, we can't let this happen again.
But it's easier said than done.
Of course,
Yeah.
but it's not anything technically. It's not landing rockets.
Yeah,
right?
but
It's
I
just
feel like
putting
there was a podcast
cables together.
There was a podcast, I think maybe this was the BG2 podcast, but it's scale is defensible in that.
But is speed of scale defensible if everyone is as well capitalized as you?
I still
If
think,
not better.
Yeah, I don't know. My take is, the same thing can be said of a lot of things at scale. It's in theory, anyone can do it, except for it's extremely hard to do it at scale.
Yeah. And I think that there's a benefit to approaching from a clean sheet of paper versus, Microsoft has data centers everywhere. They are doing CDN stuff. They have all kinds of stuff their architecture is optimized for that's not for this specific one driven purpose. And so then are they going to be well, actually, we're going to just carve out a new spot and try to build up this huge cluster to compete? Mm-hmm. No, they're going to be well, we got to take advantage of all of these distributed GPUs that we have already. And so then there's a degree to which building it all in one place does not make sense, as in you have latency to infer it, you have all kinds of stuff. And so it will seem to them as a potential waste of resources to do it that way, I think.
But that's only if they agree internally that the opportunity on the back end is not big enough to justify the change in deployment, which I don't think anyone is saying.
Well, maybe Microsoft's the wrong example, but more like a Google. Yeah. As in, because you can imagine from Microsoft's perspective where they're trying to develop Azure for everyone, and if anything, try to diversify away from OpenAI, where they say, well, sticking 200,000 GPUs in one place doesn't make sense because actually we need our European clients to try to do this stuff. And, it's now the OpenAI side and Stargate, they could try to follow this and put $500 billion into 2 data centers or something, and I think that there is a, even if it suddenly is really a 2-horse race, that is another winnowing of kind of the number of competitors here. And I think that there's there's clearly going to be people who are willing to go all in on leashing themselves to Elon, and then a set of actors who are going to see him as, or and people who will avoid Sam Altman, and vice versa. Like I think that they are both, call it contentious figures.
Yes.
And I think that there's a there's going to be continued capability. Like, it's clear everybody's pushing their chips into the table here.
Right.
And I think part of what, like, particularly Elon's strategy, like with XAI, there's all this stuff like pre-training, like you no longer can shove more money into pre-training because it's marginal returns. I think his perspective is like, but it's actually the bottom layer on which everything you do like amplifies. Mm-hmm. And so even seemingly marginal returns can make a big difference
impact.
Compounded up the stack.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to continue to shove money in. And so the others were partly saying that because it's like, well, gosh, are we really going to raise $20 billion and push it into infrastructure here? That, Anthropic is saying, well, there's other ways to like make these models perform. So I think that what'll be interesting about it is like, this is going to be like basically the size of the cluster used to train a model. Nobody had tried something larger than GPT-4. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to find out, because it's not going to be long before Elon has something a lot larger that he's going to, be throwing at this thing.
Well, I also think, Grok 3 actually makes use of the real-time Twitter feed, which is useful and unique. But I think taking a step back, it's like the pace and lack of consumer focus. We're all talking about this 03 mini high 01, right? Grok 3, all of this. It's like most people that I've spoken to outside of the AI or finance world who are actually focused on it, it's like either they've been exhausted by it and it's like, okay, whatever. It's like, yeah, of course I use it for, writing better. But it's like no one's using it, I think, in the same way that we are, or other people who are involved in the space.
They're using whatever the default is that pops up.
Right.
And they don't know, there's like no known difference.
Their entire expense is on training, buying GPUs, and data scientists, and they forgot about marketing.
Yeah.
They're not spending on marketing. That's like the reality.
Yeah.
OpenAI ran a Super Bowl commercial. I mean, they spent something on marketing. But
Wasn't
Perplexity. Perplexity.
Perplexity ran a contest. Completely different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe last Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like, I do feel most people, at least the way I see it, it's like very clear that there's the divide happening where it's like, if you ask an older person a question and they're like, oh, I don't know this. And you're like, well, I could just Google it. And it's like, okay, now there's this divide happening where it's like very clear you shouldn't be Googling stuff, right? It's like you've got to be going into this. And then the same way, it's like, what is a good researcher, or what was a good researcher? It was someone who can Google well, right? And it's like, oh,
Well, that's a talent too.
Google, no, that's what I'm saying. It was a skill.
But it's like, yes, this is a new set of skills that researchers need to take on.
Exactly.
And like, so then back to the question on OpenAI Pro, like what I have, it's very clear. People have presented online that Perplexity's deep search tool and Grok's deep search tool is the same as OpenAI's deep research tool at a fraction the cost. But that's not. It's evident, having head-to-headed them, that that's not the case. It produces, both Perplexity and Grok's, to me, is much more consistent with kind of a set of short answers from the underlying model, whereas OpenAI's, they're doing something. One, it burns a ton of inference time, so there's a lot of like chain of thought going on to figure out how to interpret sources and include embed sources, and then it produces reports that are not just 10x the length, which they are, but also at least appropriately prompted, but also that like, at least in reading them head to head on the same prompt, I like actively learn stuff from the OpenAI output, whereas the other ones, it's kind of like, oh, okay, I kind of knew all that. You know what I mean? So it does provide deeper and more context. No, I don't think that's, again, it's like, it's not like Grok's not going to work on like doing that. But there is a set of product choices that were made to enable that tool that are not necessarily obvious from the outside. And so you have to figure out how to do that, you know.
All right, you're chief futurist. Do you hire a associate futurist, or are you sticking with a $200 assistant?
I mean, I do think you know, as a whole research team, our productivity should move up with this stuff. I mean,
It definitely cuts research time in
right.
half, if not more.
Yeah, the ability to learn, to spin up on a specific subject is definitely accelerated. And you can drill in like to a pretty deep layer, you know, in a much more efficient way. And so I think I mean, you don't even need to like operate at the research level. Just look at like there was the result in Nigeria from having kids be AI tutored versus taught in classroom. They got 2 years of schooling in like 10 weeks, you know, and it's like, I think that across the board, like the ability to understand what's going on in a specific area, you know, we should all be accelerated by this if we're using it. I do think that there's a whole set of people who are just going to be like, you know, willfully ignorant of like how powerful these information tools are for some period of time. And then they'll be like, why did I get fired? And it's like, because you weren't productive relative to your competition, you know?
Well, I think that's where the user interface will make a difference, because right now it's just, you're basically staring at a blank sheet of paper. And for a lot of people, that means absolutely nothing because you don't know the right question to ask. It's like, here's a blank sheet of paper and behind it is an all-knowing being. Ask whatever you want. 9 out of 10 people are going to just stare at the blank sheet of paper and scratch their head and be like, I have no idea what to ask.
You know, I just thought of what XAI should do from a corporate strategy perspective. They should produce a device. It's a Grok device, and it'll have "Don't Panic" across the front cover. It'll be the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They could even call it the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
That would be great. I bet it would sell.
I'm surprised no one's named one of these large language models Deep Thought. I just watched Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the all-knowing computer, the one that's building the all-knowing computer, is called Deep Thought. And I'm like, there's spins on it, but why haven't we just copied that directly?
Right. Yes. I mean, yes. If anybody were going to do it, it would be XAI.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
do it.
I think actually I'm going to predict now that they will have a hardware device that says "Don't Panic" on the front of it that they release at some point.
By when? We got to make it.
It'll be called not a smartphone.
Yeah. We need.
Yeah, it'll be not a smartphone. Exactly.
We need this to be valid for the betting markets.
Yes. By 2030, I think they will have a device that says "Don't Panic" on it, emblazoned across the front cover
with Starlink capability.
I mean, probably. Like, why wouldn't you?
You'd have to.
There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the other way to think about XAI and their positioning relative to everybody else is they do have like this captive distribution, you know, arm's length, but extremely allied distribution that is just really like useful. As in, you know, if suddenly people go from an hour a day driving to an hour a day riding in a Tesla, like, you know, what is their information source? How are they finding the media that they're going to watch in the back seat of that? Like the front end is probably going to be driven by Grok, you know, and same with same with Starlink. Like, you know, what is the first language model that, you know, the marginal person lining onto the internet in Africa will get? It'll probably be XAI.
All right. I feel like this is a fruitful discussion.
Yeah. We've opened up a new market on poly
market.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
I don't know. It seems a little too niche.
I don't know if compliance is going to love it, but you definitely just opened up.
All right. We'll see everyone next week.